We'll now get ready to move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're all watching as events play out in Ottawa with respect to the alleged interference by various members of the federal government in the SNC-Lavalin affair. The discussion in Ottawa underpins one of the fundamental tenets of Western democracy, and that is that the court should be free from influence or interference from legislators. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is, does the Premier agree that it is a key principle of our democracy to ensure a separation of the judicial, the legislative and the executive branches of government?
The Honourable Premier.
Yes.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Some agreement, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2018, the term of the Chief Judge of the Provincial Court expired, and the Chief Judge was appointed to the role. My question for the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is what role or influence did the Premier or his office play in the decision to appoint Judge Williams?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you would know, Chief Williams was actually in that post. She'd been there for 5 years. If she goes back successively, they would have seen a number of people who would have gone for another 5 years. I believe there was a recommendation with 2 potential candidates. Mr. Speaker, Chief Williams was one of them. I want to congratulate her for her outstanding work with us and the work she's been doing, ensuring that we have the first wellness court, first of its kind in Canada, and we look forward to continuing to work with her. And Mr. Speaker, I also want to thank her for the work that she's been doing on the inquiry around the Home for Colored Children to understand how all branches of what we expect who should work independently, how they've all broken down for minorities in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the Premier is correct. It was a reappointment, and there was a process. And I'd like to ask the Premier, is the Premier confident that the proper process was followed in reappointing the Chief Judge?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have all the confidence in the judiciary made the recommendations. They weren't recommendations that came to us, Mr. Speaker. I believe the process they used was the one that has been used for quite some time, but I do also want to congratulate and thank the Chief Justice for her tremendous work in the Provincial Court. Chief Justice MacDonald, Mr. Speaker, is also retiring. He has done exemplary service for the people of our province. And I'm very proud, quite frankly, that this judiciary reflects the reality of Nova Scotia today. We have half of our judges are women, Mr. Speaker. We have more minorities than ever in our history, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all those who continue to make sure that the independent branch of the judiciary reflects the reality of this province, and I'm very proud to be part of a government, Mr. Speaker, that has continued to provide equal access to justice in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cheryl Burbridge is an LPN at the ER at the Valley Regional, and she says that conditions on the floor at her emergency department are so overcrowded now that they're actually dangerous, and that nurses there are having to look after so many patients that it amounts to being a violation of their standards of practice. Staff in that ER are working at 200% capacity many days. So I want to ask the Premier, wouldn't it be better to make the investments in health care that would take the pressure off ERs rather than run a generation of nurses into the ground?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. Mr. Speaker, that's why we continue to invest in collaborative care model, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that people have access to primary health care in community, Mr. Speaker. As he would know, the model of health care delivery is changing rapidly. He would also know family practice nurses are becoming an important part of that. That's why we continue to hire more family practice nurses to become part of that team, nurse practitioners as well. He's heard me say many times that some of our community social workers should be part of that a whole health care team model, and that's how we continue to believe that we can lessen the pressure on our emergency rooms across the province by continuing to build the model of health care that health care professionals want to work in today.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
in Lower Sackville, the Cobequid is keeping patients overnight because the other ERs are so overcrowded there's no place to make the transfer that they're supposed to. Staff are working overtime in order for this to happen. And last year, the NSHA's nurse overtime budget was exceeded by a factor of more than 4. So I want to ask the Premier, wouldn't it be a better use of our resources to make the investments that would take the pressure off ERs in the first place, rather than continue to spend endlessly on overtime?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what we're doing, Mr. Speaker. We've heard me talk about the redevelopment of the healthcare infrastructure that we have in the capital region, the redevelopment of the infrastructure in Cape Breton. We're talking about building the collaborative care centres across the province, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly what we're doing, Mr. Speaker, building the infrastructure that had not been invested in, Mr. Speaker, for decades. We need to make sure we make those investments, because that's how we will attract, retain healthcare providers and build the appropriate healthcare environment where all of our healthcare professionals want to work in.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
But the question of emergency room staffing across the province is not becoming less of an issue, it's becoming more of an issue all the time. We've learned just lately that the QE2 is having a hard time filling nursing shifts at the Rapid Assessment Unit, following changes in what the hospital counts or doesn't count as overtime. And while emergency RMs are meant to staff that unit, the department is now asking LPNs without emergency training to fill those shifts. So I want to ask the Premier, wouldn't we be better to make the investments in more nurses and lessen the pressure on ERs in the first place, rather than leaving our emergency rooms understaffed?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to remind him, I'm sure he paid close attention to the fact when the Minister of Finance tabled her capital plan this morning, Mr. Speaker, there is a significant investment in healthcare infrastructure to deal with the very issues that the honourable member is talking about. Mr. Speaker, I, like him, would prefer to have that infrastructure in place today, Mr. Speaker, but the honourable member, when he was in government and his power, did not address the issues that were facing Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is we are taking this issue seriously, head-on, making the investments, ensuring that the infrastructure reflects today's reality and will be there for the next 50 to 60 years, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. The Chief Judge is it's a position of considerable influence, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Judge of the Provincial Court has a variety of important roles within the court system. The Chief Judge schedules which judges hear which cases, keeping in mind that the province is one of the biggest litigators in provincial court. The Chief Judge will decide which judges will hear each and every case that involves the provincial government. It's a position of considerable influence, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Justice outline the process he used for appointing the Chief Judge?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is an established committee, Mr. Speaker, that presides over that process. That process is totally independent of government. That process also provides names to government of those who have met the criteria. Judge Williams' name was one of those presented to government who met that criteria. Chief Judge Williams was the sitting incumbent of that position, and I too want to take the opportunity to communicate to this legislature and to all Nova Scotians the valuable work that she does in that role.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister's comments about the importance of the selection committee. And I would just like maybe to ask the Minister one more time if he can talk to this House about the importance of and the significance of the selection committee in terms of the history of appointing a Chief Judge.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The process that I've just explained is a process that has been followed by consecutive governments, appointing consecutive chief judges over a number of years. If you look at the history of the appointment of past chief judges, Mr. Speaker, each of them have fulfilled subsequent terms. That's based on the performance of their work and the selection of those candidates who come forward. Presentations of names of those who come forward, Mr. Speaker, and in these circumstances, Chief Judge Williams was one of those names advanced, and given her experience and role, consistent with past practices of reappointing sitting chief judges, Judge Williams was reappointed to that position.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. The capital plan released today outlines $156.9 million for healthcare redevelopment projects in Halifax and Cape Breton. The plan provides no breakdown of exactly what that will cover and no indication of how much of that money will be spent through a P3 project. Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell this House exactly how much of that $156.9 million Nova Scotians should expect to pay for the profits the corporation that gets the very lucrative P3 deal for these hospital redevelopment plans?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, there's not been a decision as to who's completing the overall work with either the Cape Breton or the QE2 New Generation Redevelopment Projects. Mr. Speaker, as part of the overarching QE2 redevelopment project, as the member would know, Mr. Speaker, we've been taking steps, and for each step of the way, when there has been a project step, whether for design, work being done, or the actual capital work and construction step being done, they go through the RFP process and provider selected, and all of that information is made public at that time.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, looking through the capital plan, I see many worthwhile investments under health and wellness, and I'm glad the minister is attending to them now rather than deferring them for the next generation. However, he doesn't seem to be taking this approach when it comes to the QE2 redevelopment. Unless the minister decides to disclose them, we won't know the true costs of using a P3 contract for 30 years. Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit that there is a hospital-sized hole in this capital plan?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I'm pleased to advise you and my colleague, the member opposite, that in fact this is a once-in-a-generation investment in healthcare infrastructure. This is an investment in establishing healthcare infrastructure that's modernized, that has been reviewed and assessed by clinicians for their input as to how to build for the future, both in Cape Breton and in Halifax region, Mr. Speaker, on the mainland. This is listen to Nova Scotians, this is listen to healthcare providers, and this is investing in our healthcare system for our children as well as those people here today.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. The Minister of Justice has outlined that he struck a committee to find the next Chief Judge. I wonder if the Minister can share with the House who was on the Chief Judge Selection Committee.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd have to go back to the department to confirm the actual individuals who sit on that committee. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would chair that committee, Mr. Speaker. There's representation from the Provincial Judges Association. There would be, I believe, Barrister Society representation, as well as representative from government through the Department of Justice. But I can confirm those representatives.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that committee is indeed made up of the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeal, the Associate Chief Judge of the Family Court, the President of the Provincial Judges Association, and a layperson appointed by government. This is a very important committee doing very important work on behalf of the province. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Minister can confirm that he provided a terms of reference to the selection committee, and will he table those terms for the benefit of this House?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The terms of reference have been in existence for some time, Mr. Speaker. One of the responsibilities of the Minister of Justice is to provide those terms of reference to the selection committee. They were available to the selection committee, and those are the terms of reference, Mr. Speaker, that the committee used in advancing the names they did to government.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister confirm that the Minister asked for and received a recommendation from the Chief Judge Selection Committee for the next Chief Judge. Did he receive a recommendation from the committee?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
I'd have to go back into the file itself, Mr. Speaker. We received names from the committee specific to candidates, and from that list of names, Mr. Speaker, it was Chief Judge Williams who was reappointed to that position. But I can confirm the specifics of what my colleague is asking.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the recommendation of that committee is something that would have been of critical importance to the minister for sure. I'd like to ask the minister, can the minister tell this House how many candidates were put forward by the selection committee?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There were 2 candidates.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister confirm that he accepted and acted upon the recommendation of the selection committee? Did you accept the recommendation and did you act on it?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The names that were submitted for consideration, it was in fact, as the policies and procedures allow, a decision of the Minister of Justice to advance a candidate. And in these circumstances, Mr. Speaker, it was Chief Judge Williams' name who was advanced.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a copy of the terms of reference that would have been provided to the committee. And under the minister's terms of reference, it says that when appointing the Chief Judge of the Provincial Family Courts, the Governor and Council will act on the advice of the recruitment committee, that they will act on the advice. I'll table that for the benefit of the House. I'd like to ask the minister, isn't it true that rather than accept the name that was put forward by the selection committee, the minister directed the Chief Justice of this province to add another name to the short list of names put forward?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
That's not correct, Mr. Speaker. There were 2 names advanced from the committee. The terms of reference that my colleague refers to were reviewed in detail by our most senior legal officials in the Department of Justice, and as a result of that process, those procedures, and those terms of reference, Chief Judge Williams was reappointed to the position.
The Honourable Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
That's your 2 questions. So the Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Environment. 2 years ago, the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia made clear that this government has not adequately consulted Sibinigadig First Nation on the Alton Gas project. But the minister has done nothing about that. The minister has refused to pause the project's approvals or begin consultations. And in the meantime, Alton Gas is moving forward with the project. So when will the minister finally put a pause on the industrial approval and consult?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for that question. The province has had a very active role with the Alton Gas project. We've been involved with the environmental assessment. The application was brought forward and that was granted. We've also accepted their we also have approved an industrial approval, and that has terms and conditions associated with that approval.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the only thing stopping the project from moving forward while this government remains in violation of treaty obligations is the treaty truck house, which is set up by Mi'kmaq water protectors in keeping with their traditional rights. And now Alton Gas from Calgary has filed for an injunction to remove those water protectors from their own traditional lands. Now, as I said yesterday, the minister's actions are leading to injunctions instead of consultations. Hardly the path to reconciliation, Mr. Speaker. So let's just be clear. Is the minister planning to allow this project to move forward without fulfilling government's obligation to consult with Sipekne'katik First Nation?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can say that the industrial approval is still valid, and we are monitoring it, monitoring the terms and conditions to make sure that they do stay compliant. As for the issues with Alton Gas and the First Nations that are on the site, that is a matter certainly between law enforcement and Alton Gas. It's not the province is not involved with that. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the minister indicated that the committee put forward 2 names, but in fact, I have the letter from the chair of the selection committee dated June 13th. I'll table that for the benefit of the House. The letter says to the minister that there were 2 candidates, but the committee made 1 recommendation to fill the position. That's the letter that was sent to the minister with 1 recommendation. And I know the minister rejected that recommendation and instead directed the selection committee to include another name, even though the selection committee had already made it clear who they thought the best choice was. And I can table a letter from the minister to the selection committee on July 19th instructing them to add another name to their list despite what they wanted. Mr. Speaker, that's called political interference. That's what's happening in Ottawa. That's what shouldn't happen here, but it is happening here. I'd like to ask the minister, was the minister acting alone when he decided to undermine the selection process and force them to add another name to the list?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague has referred to the terms of reference, Mr. Speaker. We have applied the process in these circumstances as is required, Mr. Speaker. There is interpretation, Mr. Speaker, within the legislation and within the terms of reference. That's what was applied here, Mr. Speaker. We looked at all of the factors and the reappointment of previous provincial court judges in fulfilling their role and their mandate. In these circumstances, Mr. Speaker, the chief judge, who was the incumbent, was reappointed consistent with the process and the terms of reference.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the terms of reference the minister refers to required the minister to act on the recommendation of the committee. The minister did not act on the recommendation of the committee. The minister instructed the committee to add another name despite what they thought was best for the court system of this province. So I'd like to ask the minister again, who did the minister consult with before deciding to throw out the name that was put forward by the selection committee and force his choice onto the short list as the Chief Justice?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure my colleague that no names were thrown out, Mr. Speaker, from the process that was applied. The 2 names that were provided were considered. We explored all of the options within the process that my colleague has outlined. We reviewed the terms of reference that were applicable in this case and have been in past cases where the provincial judge appointment has been vacant and reappointments or appointments are required. There was nobody else instructed or guided the Department of Justice or my office in this process. This process was fulfilled with direct legal input and advice from the most senior legal officials in the Department of Justice. I came to a decision, Mr. Speaker, based on all of those factors. I brought that decision forward to my cabinet colleagues as the process requires, and Chief Judge Williams was reappointed.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the minister called for the selection committee to be struck. We know that that was a committee of very, very distinguished judicial minds. I've said the names of the positions of the people that were on there. The problem was they didn't pick the candidate that the minister wanted. They didn't choose the candidate that the minister wanted. That was the problem. So, but the minister then instructed them to add another name to the list. My question for the minister is, is that a decision that the minister made on his own? Or did the minister receive any direction from the Premier or the Premier's office on how to handle the situation where the selection committee didn't select the candidate that they wanted selected.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Within the process that my colleague has outlined, Mr. Speaker, there are policies and procedures, there are terms of reference, there is an opportunity and a process that we went through in reviewing all of those elements of the selection process, Mr. Speaker, and as I alluded to further, I spoke with, consulted with, and engaged the most senior legal minds in the Department of Justice, in our Legal Services Division, the law firm for government, and it was the direct advice and input of only those senior officials that contributed to my decision, Mr. Speaker, in reappointing or recommending the reappointment of Chief Judge Williams.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the process is well established. It's been in place for decades. It's only this government that has chosen to override that process because they didn't get the answer they wanted from the process that worked. The minister had the opportunity at the onset to directly reappoint, but instead the minister chose to strike a selection committee, possibly for political cover, for a decision that he might have already made. The minister overruled the selection of the committee. And earlier today and last fall, when my colleague asked the question, the Premier stated, he stated again the importance of judicial independence to our democracy. So I'd like to ask the minister again, were there conversations between senior staff in the minister's office and staff in the Premier's office as to how to come up with a way to overrule the selection committee's candidate and undermine the entire process?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question because he has outlined, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, the transparency that I applied to this process. He is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. I had the unique opportunity to reappoint Chief Judge Williams without any consideration of any other candidates, Mr. Speaker. I was not required to strike the committee or ask the Chief Justice to bring that committee forward for purposes of a selection process. It was because of my commitment in the Department of Justice to the transparency of these processes, Mr. Speaker, that we actually opened that process, Mr. Speaker, to another opportunity. But it was the collective outcome, Mr. Speaker, of all the information. It was the transparent application of that process, Mr. Speaker, that resulted in the reappointment of a very competent Chief Judge.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier and the Minister spoke with a glowing pride of the process, and it is a nice process, except when it doesn't get the result they want and they have to override it. Destroying the Public Accounts Committee is very dangerous, but seizing control of the justice system is an entirely other matter. Even the Chief Justice has made a statement about it. After the minister rejected the recommendation of the selection committee, Chief Justice MacDonald resigned rather than participate in this farce.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, Chief Justice has made a statement about what happened here. The Chief Justice resigned rather than participate in such a farce again. Will the minister confirm that Chief Justice MacDonald resigned after feeling the justice system had been undermined by the minister during this process?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'll go back to the point of my colleague's question. He's trying to determine, he's trying to make a connection of a decision outside of my office where I may have been influenced by direction or someone else guiding me as to how and who should be selected. And I want to assure my colleagues in this legislature and those Nova Scotians, at no time did anyone give me direction on the selection process. It was a discussion internally within the department with my deputy minister and the most senior legal officials within the department, Mr. Speaker, that resulted in a transparent application of that process. I can't speak to why Chief Justice MacDonald resigned, other than to say that I have worked on multiple files, multiple discussions about enhancing the access to justice in the province of Nova Scotia, and I have had nothing but the most highest level of cooperation and support through Chief Justice MacDonald and his colleagues.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the minister may not be able to speak for Chief Justice reasoning behind his resignation, but the Chief Justice speaks for himself in his resignation letter. The Chief Justice says, representing the common interests of each and every judge in the province is fundamental to my role as Chief Justice of Nova Scotia. The recent recruitment committee process for the appointment of the Chief Judge of the Provincial and Family Courts has undermined that role. Those are the words from Chief Justice in his resignation letter. And he says that he can't participate in that type of a process anymore. So the minister might not be able to speak for Chief Justice, but he doesn't have to, because the Chief Justice spoke for himself. So will the minister confirm that the Chief Justice resigned after feeling undermined by the minister in this process?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I can't speak for the reasons for Chief Justice MacDonald resigning. My colleague is referring to a piece of correspondence, Mr. Speaker. I've had ongoing interactions with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, as well as the Chief Justice of the Family Court and the Chief Justice of our Trial Division, Mr. Speaker. I meet twice a year with the Chief Justices and judges of the province to build a relationship. We have over extensive discussions, Mr. Speaker, established what we believe to be the independence of the judiciary and the independence of the Executive Council, but we also speak, Mr. Speaker, about the interdependence of those two bodies and our collective efforts to work together. We have continued on that journey, Mr. Speaker. We will continue on that journey with the new Chief Justice of the province of Nova Scotia, and I look forward to that appointment.
I think you're done with your supplementary. One more? Okay, my apologies. You've had a lot of questions. I think I've lost track. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it sounds nice. It sounds nice, but the issue is that the Chief Justice of this province felt undermined by the actions of this minister, who rejected the recommendation of the selection committee and essentially said, we don't care what you're saying, put my name on the list so I can choose it. That's political interference, and that's wrong, Mr. Speaker. It should never happen. This cabinet should never be dabbling in the workings of the court. And I'd like to ask the minister one more time. Can the minister confirm that the Chief Justice resigned because he felt undermined, as he stated in his letter?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can only repeat, I can't speak for the Chief Justice. My colleague is referring to a piece of correspondence. What I can say, Mr. Speaker, is we continued up until his retirement, February 1st, Mr. Speaker, to maintain an open-door policy of discussion between the judiciary, who we recognize to be independent of government. We spoke about the independence of the Executive Council, and we may not have always agreed on those factors, Mr. Speaker, but where we did land is the importance of the judiciary and government working with each other to enhance access to justice, Mr. Speaker. We have done that, but I want to assure my colleague and everyone in this House, we applied the process that exists for the selection of the Chief Judge of the Provincial Court of Nova Scotia. We did that with senior legal advice and interpretation of policies and legislatures and procedures within the process that my colleague has referred to, Mr. Speaker. We have appointed a competent Chief Judge.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Okay. The process was not followed, Mr. Speaker. The committee made a recommendation. That recommendation was not the choice of the minister, so the minister instructed the committee to add another name to the list. There's nothing in the procedure that says if the minister doesn't like the recommendation, that they can put another name on the list. The process was not followed, and the process required that the minister will act on the results and the recommendations of the committee. This is political interference at its worst, Mr. Speaker. It is offensive to Nova Scotians, and the minister needs to give an explanation as to why he felt it was okay to overrule the committee, and do so to an extent that forced the Chief Justice of this province to resign and say, I don't want to be part of this, you've undermined me. Why did the minister take that action?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One thing I do want to clarify with my colleague, at no time did I instruct the committee to add names. The committee advanced 2 names, Mr. Speaker. Based on my direction, the department went back in to look at the policies and procedures and processes as laid out in the terms of reference, Mr. Speaker, and it was the legal advice and interpretation that was provided to me, the guidance that I receive on a daily basis from the most senior legal officials in this province, Mr. Speaker. And as a result of that, Mr. Speaker, we believe, and I fundamentally believe, that we have applied the process as transparently as possible. And I want to remind my colleague, as he outlined, I didn't have to strike a committee or ask the committee. We chose to, Mr. Speaker, because we wanted to be transparent. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, of those interpretations and that application, we have appointed a competent Chief Judge of our provincial court.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'll take a break now and turn to education. My question is for the Minister of Education. Last month, Educators for Social Justice released a report on their survey of teachers in the province, hundreds of teachers, and one of the things confirmed by the report is that many of them are actively thinking about leaving the profession and/or leaving the province. Mr. Speaker, there's already a shortage of teachers and substitutes, and the province needs more, not fewer, educators. Mr. Speaker, what is the minister's plan to retain qualified teachers in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just to remind the member, we've actually hired 1,300 new people into our education system, over 1,000 of which were teachers. Teachers who I believe were excited to be engaged in a meaningful profession here in Nova Scotia, and hundreds of non-teaching supports as well. So we've actually gone through a period of the greatest hiring that this province has seen in a long time. We now have the highest ratio of teachers to students than we've ever had in the province of Nova Scotia, at least on record. We now have the most amount of non-teaching supports in the province that we've ever had. That's not to say that it's an easy job or that it's without challenges, which is why we're doing our very best to increase investment in education. We've done that by about 30% and ensure that all of our great teachers in the system have the supports that they need to give the best education possible to our students.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, those are new positions, not new hires, and the experience on the ground is anything but what the minister tells us. They're new hires, but they're not necessarily new people. My mistake. People are moving laterally, and the experience on the ground is that there are not enough teachers, there are not enough substitutes, and there are not enough specialists. Mr. Speaker, teachers love what they are doing, but this government's approach to education has left teachers feeling disrespected and demoralized, and there's no one that can argue with that. Teacher shortages are a problem across the country, and the government here needs to be focused on recruitment and retention soon, or teachers will be as scarce as family doctors. More than half of the teachers who responded to the survey I mentioned before said that the government's legislated contract had not improved their situation or had in fact made things worse. And the public seems to agree. Almost 60% of Nova Scotians believe the government's actions have had a negative impact on the quality of public education. Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit that his heavy-handed approach on this file has made the problems in our education system worse?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, we did go through a difficult contract negotiation that led to a legislative contract. But that's not to say our government hasn't actually acted on the interests of teachers and our students in the system. We have increased investments in education by over $300 million at a time when enrollment has declined. We have implemented class caps. We have hired new positions into the system, 1,300 in total, Mr. Speaker. And we've brought in non-teaching supports for the first time. And the feedback we're actually getting from our regions, from the front lines, is positive. Mr. Speaker. What's interesting is these increased investments that we've seen, the budgets to hire these new people, have been voted against by the New Democrats, Mr. Speaker. Do you know what budgets they did vote for? Budgets that cut $65 million out of the education system, cut reading recovery, and cut 1,100 teaching positions from this system, Mr. Speaker. And perhaps the member can explain our next preamble the discrepancy between her voting record in this House and her words in this chamber.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, I heard the Minister of Justice say that my colleague was not correct, that there were 2 names advanced by the committee. But that's not the case, not originally. Why would the Minister suggest that?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I referenced 2 names because it was, in fact, 2 names that I recall being part of this discussion and this process, Mr. Speaker. That's why I've referenced 2 names.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps that's not what the Minister recalls, but we've tabled information today that proves that there was 1 name that came forward. Just 1 name. The recommendation by the committee. Why did the Minister not accept the recommendation of the committee for that judge as was prescribed by the process?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, I take exception to the way my colleague has presented that statement, Mr. Speaker, as prescribed by the process. The process is much broader, Mr. Speaker, as is outlined in all of the policies and procedures and the terms of reference that outline that appointment process, Mr. Speaker. This process internally within the Department of Justice necessitated me engaging the most senior legal officials in the department to interpret that process, Mr. Speaker, and apply it appropriately. That's what we did. There were 2 names that were initially advanced, Mr. Speaker. When we looked at the collective circumstances and the incumbent being one of those 2 names, Mr. Speaker, and the past reappointment of chief judges of the provincial court, I made a decision, independent of anybody else, to reappoint a competent chief judge.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have as evidence the Chief Justice's resignation from the committee as proof that the Chief Justice himself did not feel that this process was followed. So don't look to us, Mr. Speaker, in the opposition to answer this question. The Chief Justice answered it. So, Mr. Speaker, the Minister said that nobody was instructed by his office as part of this process, but is it not the case that his office instructed the committee to go back and give him another name so he could appoint the judge he wanted to appoint?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, that's not correct, Mr. Speaker. In advancing the portfolios of the 2 candidates, which are required by the terms of reference, Mr. Speaker, the committee did not advance the portfolio of a second candidate. I simply asked for the portfolio of the second name that was part of the process, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the committee made a recommendation. The committee was struck to make the recommendation. The Minister did not want to take the recommendation, so he instructed the committee to come back to him with another name, which he preferred. But, Mr. Speaker, that undermines the whole process. That is why the Chief Justice resigned from the committee. And that is why the Minister has a question to answer which he's not answered yet. And that is, why did he interfere in this process?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I know how my colleague chooses to frame these questions, and I know exactly what my colleague is trying to achieve. But I need to reassure my colleague that I did not ask for another name. I asked for the portfolio of the second name that was part of the process, Mr. Speaker. I asked, consistent with the terms of reference and the names that were being advanced, a portfolio I needed to know that background information in assessing the candidates, Mr. Speaker. I didn't have it. It was my intention to make an informed decision because I want to remind my colleagues, I didn't have to go to that selection process. I could have arbitrarily reappointed the chief judge. And I hear heckling from my colleagues in the back. If they understood the process, Mr. Speaker, they would clearly understand what I'm sharing with them. We appointed, Mr. Speaker, we appointed a competent chief judge to head our provincial courts.
The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the minister tried to be transparent with the selection of the committee, but the problem was the committee didn't play along. And it's a bit of a giggle for the minister to say he wanted the portfolio of the other candidate who was already the chief judge. But apparently the minister needed to see the resume of that person. The reality is 2 candidates applied. The selection committee picked one and advanced the name. Now, Mr. Speaker, how laughable is it that the minister went back and said, can you please rank all the applicants? They were ranked. One name was put forward. He wanted the other name on the list so he could choose from it. So I'd like to ask the minister, had the minister made up his mind before he struck the selection committee? Was this just a farce to give him some cover that didn't exactly work? Or did he consider the recommendation at all?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
So Mr. Speaker, why would I advance the work of a committee if I had already made my decision specific to the presiding judge, Mr. Speaker? Why would I do that, Mr. Speaker? There's a process, Mr. Speaker, to follow. And I indicated earlier that it was my intention and the intention of the Department of Justice to be transparent in the application of that process, because I recognize how important that position is, Mr. Speaker, to the rule of law in the province of Nova Scotia. The committee, Mr. Speaker, is incumbent to follow those policies, procedures, and terms of reference. The committee was required to provide a portfolio of both candidates, and they did not, Mr. Speaker. What I did is I asked the committee for the portfolio of the second candidate. That is a transparent application of the process, and at the end of the process, Mr. Speaker, we appointed a competent chief judge of the Provincial Court of Nova Scotia.
The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Speaker, my question is for the Premier. I want to circle back to what's happening in Ottawa. There's been mounting evidence that the Prime Minister and his office have interfered or may have interfered in the judicial system, and I think they're right here with the appointment of this Chief Judge. We're trending on very similar ground. Mr. Speaker, there shouldn't be 1 second in this province where any judge thinks for a minute, I wonder what the Premier would want. And what the Minister has done with this process is kind of sowed that doubt, and that's a shame. We're closer to that situation than ever. I'd like to ask the Premier, did the Premier or other members of Cabinet realize that the Minister was undermining the entire process and overruling the recommendation of the Selection Committee?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, at no time was I involved in this process. I want to commend the Minister of Justice who laid out a process, Mr. Speaker, that has been followed by successive governments, Mr. Speaker. In the terms of reference that the Honourable Member tabled in this House, Mr. Speaker, recommended committee report. The committee shall submit to the Minister of Justice a short list of recommended candidates with précis of information about each. Mr. Speaker, the short list will normally contain not fewer than 3, Mr. Speaker, and no more than 6 candidates, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly what the Minister of Justice asked for, Mr. Speaker. And the only interference this government has ever had in the judiciary, Mr. Speaker, is we tore apart the old boys' club that was put in there by the Tories and NDP, Mr. Speaker, and made it gender equality in Nova Scotia. That's what we've done, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, 2 candidates applied, and the Premier would have you believe that the Selection Committee couldn't report a recommendation unless they put 3 names forward. Only 2 people applied. You can't get a list any shorter than 2 people applied, and this is our recommendation. If the Minister needed to see a resume to know who the number 2 ranking was, then there's bigger problems in this province than what we're talking about right here. The applicants were ranked. The committee made their selection, and the government didn't like it. So in the vein of this government and creating their own old boys club and back room. They overruled the collection and appointed somebody who wasn't on the list.
The Honourable Premier.
Again, thank the Honourable Member for the question. Again, I want to read it to him again, Mr. Speaker. It says the short list will normally not contain, Mr. Speaker. We do not expect people to add names that don't exist, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, we appointed Chief Justice Williams to this position, Mr. Speaker, under the guidance of Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice, who's followed the process, Mr. Speaker, and I will put that Minister of Justice integrity against any member in this House, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell you, he's had a career, Mr. Speaker. He's had a career of applying the law in this province, Mr. Speaker, and he's done a tremendous job, Mr. Speaker, being Attorney General of the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's not the members of this House that are weighing in on this, Mr. Speaker. It's the Chief Justice of this province that resigned. And the Chief Justice made a statement by resigning just 2 months before he was retiring and said that that minister undermined the process. That's not us, Mr. Speaker. That's the Chief Justice of the province.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers.